Hello everyone and welcome to the very first of our Rebrandly Link-Ups series, where we bring you actionable online marketing insights from the experts. This week we're going to be talking to David Lee Kim, the Senior Growth Marketing Manager of Hubspot, about his team's approach to growth experiments. So, David, thanks a million for joining us today. To kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, HubSpot, and maybe your position there?
Yeah, I'll start with HubSpot. So HubSpot is known for our CRM, marketing, sales, customer service software, and we focus on small to medium-sized businesses. So we want to make sure that these businesses have access to tools that they need to grow their businesses without having to deal with all the confusion or complexity of software that might come with other tools. And what I do at HubSpot is I'm responsible for helping us grow the number of people using our free tools. So the free tools were relatively a new thing for us. We previously didn't have that until 2 or 3 years ago. And now the goal is to get as many people as possible using them, just because there's a lot of value in them. And it's a way for people to experience what it's like to use our tools without even having to pay for it. So right now, the way that we're doing that is through a lot of partnerships, through product work and optimizations, and figuring out how we can work with other technology companies as well to share users.
So today, David, as you know, we're going to be focusing on growth experiments. So would you mind giving us a brief overview of how HubSpot approaches growth and the growth experimentation process overall? How involved are you in developing the experiment strategies?
Yeah, so in the beginning, when we first started running these sort of experiments, I was extremely involved. So for each experiment, we have a piece of documentation that walks through the different pieces of an experiment, which includes the research, the hypothesis, the experiment design, and so on. And up until recently, we would sit down one-on-one with each person that had the idea, and we would actually walk through the experiment, talk through it, and ask each other questions on why the experiment's worth running. And it all comes back to this idea of hypothesis, which is what we believe to be true about our customers today. And that could be in a specific scenario or very general. So nowadays, the process is we'll have a document where everyone drops in their ideas. And this is something that people can review before a meeting. And once we have the meeting where we start actually going through the ideas and doing some extra brainstorming, that's where we start defining which ones we want to go deep in. And in each idea or experiment idea has a DRI, which is the directly responsible individual. And that person is responsible for doing all the research and proving out that the experiment's worth doing. And in a lot of cases, as they do the research, we'll find that it's not worth doing anymore. Either it's too much effort, it's technically not possible right now, or it's not a big enough potential impact for us to say it's worth putting in that effort. So once we decide which ideas we want to run with, that's when we'll put everything into a documentation, and we'll actually have a final run through of what the experiment actually is. And at this point, even though all the research is done, even though for the most part the numbers make sense and we do believe it's worth running, it's still up for criticism. So we can still ask, why do we still believe that this is worth running versus everything else that we could be doing? So there's a sense of radical prioritization across our team. A big reason for that is because we're a B2B software company, we don't really work with the amount of traffic as, say, a Facebook or Google does. So we need to be extremely picky and have a fine filter of what experiments we deem to be worth running and taking that experimental cycle.
So, David, in your time at HubSpot, you and your growth team must have run through quite a number of experiments. So would you mind giving us an example of one that was a success and one that was a bit of a failure, and what you would have learned in both cases as well?
Yeah. So I'll take that question and answer it with just one experiment, because we tend to view failures as successes anyway, because we learned a lot from this one particular experiment. And it was this idea of experimenting with the sign-up flow. And we got inspiration for this from Pinterest. I've spoken to one of the engineers at Pinterest, and I learned that every single piece of the Pinterest sign-up flow has been A/B tested. They've tested the copy, they've tested the colors and the layout and everything. And we realized that we hadn't touched our sign up flow app in 2 years. So we figured, anything we do is likely going to be upside. Let's figure out what we can do here. And a really simple concept that we thought about was, well, why don't we just put some social proof and test out which types of social proof might perform better in terms of improving the number of people completing a sign up flow. So that could be showing logos of existing customers we have, perhaps very well-known logos. It could be showing testimonials. It could be showing industry awards we've won. Let's test those all out and see if they perform better than what we currently have, which was nothing. We ended up running this experiment. We saw absolutely no improvement. It was actually flat. And this caught us off guard just because, in marketing, psychology, social proof is the thing that everyone agrees is something that works. In our case, whatever it may be, it might have been the experiment design, but in the way that we set it up, it didn't really perform very well. But that led to a lot of other questions like, well, why didn't it work well? What other pieces of the sign-up flow could we be testing that could be higher impact? And all this questioning led to a few other experiments, but ultimately it led to us redesigning the entire sign-up flow, which resulted in a couple points, percentage points increase in the conversion rate, which translates to a lot of new signups. So even though it was this one failure of an experiment, we learned from it and we started iterating and asking deeper questions about what's technically wrong with the signup flow that this didn't work. And we ended up realizing that a lot of it was technical problems that we needed to fix before doing that sort of front-end experiment. So that's our failure and success.
So, David, speaking on this topic recently, you mentioned that a B2B company such as HubSpot mightn't have quite the same reach as a larger B2C company. So your team prefers to focus on impact and not activity. So could you expand on this a little bit more for us?
Yeah, by impact. So when we think about an experiment, because HubSpot's a relatively older company, we're about 12 years old now, we have a lot of data that we can look at. And as we've continued experimenting, we continue to collect more data. And each experiment we have, we try to map it as far as we can or as close as we can to revenue generated. So it might be as simple as saying, I want to add some social proof on a sign-up flow, and I believe that'll improve the sign-up flow conversion rate by 2%. These are fake numbers, by the way. And that 2% would translate to getting 500 more signups per month. And we value a signup at $10. So that means we could expect an extra $5,000 in revenue per month. So we have those sort of numbers that we can use to start modeling out what the impact could be. Granted, these numbers, it's all speculation, but they're educated guesses based on previous experience we've done and what the value of a customer is and all of that to us so that we can actually make a case for what's worth running. And that allows us to compare each experiment to each other of, well, this experiment, we expect a 10% improvement, but the revenue impact isn't that high compared to if we improve another metric by 1%, which could have a larger impact. So it requires having the data and also being able to do the research into whether or not that makes sense. And for a lot of companies, we realize that for example, startups don't always have that much data. So it really comes down to making a gut check and just making a call on whether it's worth running and just believing and understanding why it's worth running.
So, David, would you be able to give us, in I guess as compact a version as you can, the process for defining and carrying out an experiment from A to Z?
Yeah, I'll try to summarize it as much as I can. So the way I'll approach it is every experiment usually comes from some sort of knowledge that you've gained where you have a question as to why it is the way it is. So I'll continue using an example of the sign-up flow. So one question that we might have had was, hey, why hasn't anyone tested the sign-up flow? And it could be as general as that, or it could be as simple as, why don't we have any more content on the sign-up flow to just show the value prop? And then, I wonder how well the sign-up flow is converting. So all those different questions might lead to, hey, I think we should add some more content on the sign-up flow to improve the conversion rate because it hasn't been tested on in 2 years. So that's kind of the basis for why you believe it's worth digging into to understand that to understand what you want to experiment with. And then there comes the research of, I wonder why the conversion rate is where it currently is. And that's when you start thinking about the people going through that sign up flow and asking, well, I wonder why they aren't completing the sign up flow. And that's when you can either just reach out to people who have signed up and ask why they signed up, or find a way to survey people who haven't signed up yet and get them to walk through the flow and have them talking out why or what they're thinking about as they get through the flow. And you start developing hypotheses. And based off those hypotheses of why people aren't completing the flow, you would just come up with different ideas of what you can do to improve that conversion rate. And as you come with those ideas, you start thinking, okay, these ideas are worth running. These are too much effort. These are low effort, but maybe high impact. And you start prioritizing. And then you think about, okay, well, how many different variations do you want to test? And how long do we need to run this for to reach statistical significance? And then once you do all that, you have this peer review where everyone on the team looks through it and agrees, yeah, this is worth running. Let's run it next week or in 2 weeks. Let's slot it in so that we have it scheduled. And once you run the experiment, you have the DRI analyze the data to make sure that, to see whether or not it performed well. And I always have to call this out, but there's this idea of p-hacking where you could manipulate the data to show results that are more favorable than they actually are. And I won't go into a statistics talk, but do some research on p-hacking. Don't do it. It's not good. And no one wins. But the biggest part of all this is the post-mortem readout that we do. So each experiment gets a readout, which summarizes why it was worth running, what the expected results were, what the actual results were, what the learnings were, and what the next steps are. So this is generally when more ideas come out of experiments to run, and also helps you refine, well, we shouldn't have ran that experiment at all. So in the future, let's keep that in mind so that we don't keep running these experiments that aren't really worth our time. So that's the piece that I'd say is easiest to skip, just because it's easy to say, well, we finished this experiment, let's move on to the next one. But that's generally a mistake.
Wow, okay, it's a pretty solid summarization. Thanks a million, David. So in terms of the growth experimentation process, let's take Rebrandly, for example. What would your opinion be about branding and managing your links and the effect that would have on growth?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things to test. I mean, it's based off the audience for sure, but there are cases where you might set up an experiment that involves improving the click-through rate on a link, and that comes in two ways. You can have a branded link using Rebrandly, and it can be a short branded link versus a long link with all the parameters attached. And nowadays, people are becoming more savvy when it comes to these sort of tracking and cookies, and they actually will pay attention to when there's those sort of parameters. And I mean, I myself will see those parameters and actually delete them sometimes, so I don't get tracked. So it's something to test whether having a branded link or not can improve conversion rate. And in terms of setting up the test with Rebrandly, you can track all the click metrics on it. So you don't need to set up those things with another third-party provider. It's all there. You can look at the performance through just one tool. So that makes it extremely easy, especially for people who are just trying to get started with some simple experiments.
So just to finish up then, if you could give viewers 3 essential, actionable pieces of advice when it comes to growth experiments, what would they be?
Yeah, I'd say the first one is, do not start with ideas, start with a hypothesis and what you believe to be true about your customer. That's generally how the best experiments come out, and it's how you differentiate from just copying other companies and what experiments they're doing. The second one is, do not p-hack ever. That is one of the biggest mistakes anyone can make when it comes to experimentation. And then the third one is, be extremely candid with your team about feedback and ways to improve the process. A growth team, whether it be doing experiments or building things, the team is an experiment in itself, and there's always ways to refine a process and improve that process. So it's always important to take a few steps back and reflect on, yes, the experimentation, and also how the team's working together and how you can improve the way your team works and the type of experiments you run.
Okay, well, that's everything said, really. Thanks a million for joining us today, David. Any closing thoughts on your end, or anywhere people could find you online if they want to chat further?
Yeah, closing thoughts. I mean, I think there's a lot of content out there about experimentation and growth and all that, and it's easy to get paralyzed with all the things you can do and all the technology that's out there. I think the simplest thing is just get started, start running some experiments. They may not be the most bulletproof hypothesis or anything, but once you start running those motions, it'll become easier, and you can continue to add complexity in how you think about experiments as you go, instead of trying to start with complex things. As for where people can find me, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook at David Lee Kim. I'd also, one of the things I love doing is, as I give these talks and do interviews, is I love to get feedback on how more of these can be more useful. And also, I like to give users some sort of resource. So if users go to, and I'm sure you can share the link with them, if viewers go to davidleekim.com/Rebrandly, it'll take you to a survey. I'll just ask a couple of questions on how useful this interview was. And then at the end, you'll get some growth resources based off the exact documentation that Hubspot uses. So hopefully that's helpful. And I appreciate everyone listening, and thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a million for joining us, David, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Take care. If you enjoyed, please be sure to comment, share, like, and subscribe. Every bit of support we can get, and anyone who wants to watch this is welcome. If you want to get in contact, you can follow the branded link here on screen, or catch us on all of our social channels as well. And until the next link up, take care.